How do we make and multiply disciples around the block and around the world? With hosts Doug Lucas of Team Expansion, Lee Wood of One Body Church, John Hirima of Big Life, Roger Shull of E3 Partners, and special guests from around the world, we'll explore how believers can come together to make more disciples. Welcome to the More Disciples podcast.
All right, here with another episode of the More Disciples podcast. I am Roger Shull, one of the co-hosts here, along with my fellow host, Doug Lucas.
Good day.
And Lee Wood.
Hey, everybody.
And John Hirima. He's just busy with ministry work, just making sure disciples are made. So he's not joining us this week. He's just applying what we talk about, right? But today we have someone that should be familiar to our regular listeners and viewers of the More Disciples podcast. We have Zach Duke as our guest.
Yes,
finally.
Duke.
It's like his 10th time on the podcast. We've never been able to hear his story yet.
They finally broke down and asked the lowest person to join.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you guys all know him well, but Lee, why don't you still just give him a little bit of an introduction for us, then we'll kick it over to Zach.
Yeah, so you guys know that I'm fond of being able to quote the King James Bible. So when I think about Zach, I have no greater joy than to hear my children walk according to truth. Zach falls inside of walking through all of the 7 things that we've learned in Tampa in 7 years. And God spoke to me about pursuing relationship with Zach, and I responded to that. And it's been a joy just to collaborate. He and Megan and their family from their home are image bearers. They are the real deal that love Jesus, that hear, obey, and spread from their household to their city, to the region, to the nations. The thing that I love most about my brother, I can say, is if I had a life verse, one to pin it down to, besides John 17:23, it would be, for the love of Christ constraineth us, for we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead, that they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto him who died and rose again. The love of Jesus relationally permeates out of my brother's life, and it is such an encouragement to an older dinosaur to see the faithfulness of him and his household. And Jesus is glorified. And I got this verse from Josh. I called you Josh, Zach.
Always. It's always Josh for some reason.
Yes, for some reason. Everybody calls Zach Josh. It's a weird thing. But
I don't call
that the glory of God might cover the earth as the water covers the sea. And that's something that's captivated me from him actually sharing, hey, this is what we're actually doing from Habakkuk. That's my brother. That's my friend. And I'm so excited for him to be on the podcast as a guest instead of like being the guest host, man. So we get to ask him questions and listen to him answer.
Yeah, he's the permanent substitute host. We just have him on call basically.
He's so much better, man, than I am. That's like the deal, man. He's better looking, man. He's more articulate. True. He's all of those things.
I'm just younger. That's it.
Yeah.
Well, Zach, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers? Just maybe you can just share a little bit about yourself and also share how you started getting involved with movement work and what God has you doing today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a loaded question, so I'll try to be as brief as I can. But first, Lee, just thank you for that introduction. You know how much you mean to me, as a friend, as a father figure even. You just mean so much to me, as do others like Curtis and John Hirima and Forrest Head and countless others. Just it's a family-oriented ministry, right? Like the following Jesus is a team sport, and we need one another. So for me, I'm from the boondocks of Indiana. I grew up as a farm kid. My mom and dad were the ones that poured their lives into me, and I think it's a great example of generational growth in a real sense. And they modeled for me loving Jesus, following Jesus, spreading Jesus in real tangible ways with our extended family, with strangers, going prayer walking, sharing the gospel. Before I really even knew what any of that was, my mom and my dad and even my grandparents, who Lee has met, have modeled this for me. And so at a young age, even before I repented and followed Jesus, I loved him. Even before I was part of his family, He loved me and I loved him. And so when that time happened, when I gave my life to the Lord, I just took off like a rocket. And I just wanted everybody to know this Jesus that means so much to me. And I was honestly just bewildered when people didn't want him and didn't want a relationship with him. Like, that was strange for me. And as I would share with classmates growing up, I would have people tell me they are okay going to hell. And once again, as a fourth grade mind, that just, I had no paradigm for this. And so as I got on the school bus that day, my bus driver was like, "What's wrong?" I told her what happened that day. And instead of patting this little fourth grader on the back, she's just like, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" I'm like, "Well, what am I going to do about it?" So I went home, told my mom, and we prayed. And we said, "Let's start gathering our friends in the morning and start sharing Jesus with them before school." So we did. We got permission from our principal and started gathering once a week in our school and started having 80, 100 people from this little country school, and started seeing my friends come to Jesus. What's amazing, and what has absolutely nothing to do with me and the Spirit, but what God has done since that time, because after sixth grade, I had nothing to do with that Bible study. But it is still going on today, 20 years later, and it has spread across Indiana and even has some all the way over to Alaska. I mean, it just has spread nationally. And once again, if I tried to control that, I am sure I would have ruined it. But because it was passed on, it was able to grow and to spread. So Amen. Long story short, I ended up going to Liberty University. I studied missiology there. And that's when this passion of following Jesus started to have a little bit of railroad tracks, understanding the nations, understanding cultures, having a heart for people groups, getting some basic movement principles from Perspectives for those who know who the Perspectives course is, and ended up winding up as on the mission staff at Prestonwood Baptist Church, and further developed there, had some more training and disciple making, and then ultimately joined Big Life's team back in 2014. And just a couple months later, we met Curtis Sargent and was trained down in Alabama.
All roads lead back to Curtis.
It seems that way by and large. And I'm grateful for it, because that time in May in 2015 changed my life forever. And one thing I remember being struck by Curtis at that time was I was reading the Beatitudes, and it said the meek will inherit the earth. And I thought, oh my goodness, that was literal, because I just met the meekest man I've ever known. And I've seen someone who has inherited the earth. And that really, really marked me of meekness and humility in the middle of movement. So long story short, I've been pursuing movements in this very specific way since 2014.
That's great. I guess if I think about you, Zach, I think about the way you have that concentric ring thing going on in your life. Would you say a word about what you're doing locally and how that relates to what you're doing regionally, and then how that relates to what you're doing nationally? Because it's beautiful. Yeah.
Great question.
Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. And
exactly. One thing that I've believed for a long time is you can't really steward. I'm a farmer, right? You can't steward the field if you don't steward the garden. And so you got to start in your home. So it starts as disciples and churches right here in this living room that I'm sitting in right now, Zach and my wonderful bride, Megan. Like, we are the church in our home. We are disciples in our home. We are stewarding our 4 beautiful kids, helping them to hear, obey, and to follow Jesus. If we can do that in our home, now we can help multiply that disciples and churches in other homes. So that's what we've seen here in this central Indiana region, is we've had families that are churches, disciples in their own homes, spreading to communities, to neighborhoods. And then as disciples and churches now begin to network in the communities, we have now seen emerging city churches in several places in Indiana now. In 3 different locations in Indiana, we have city churches that have emerged, that even on a greater level or greater fractal, right? Disciples and churches within this state, same thing is happening regionally across the United States, nationally, and ultimately and simultaneously, we're doing the same thing here in Bargersville, Indiana, that I'm doing in Bukavu, Congo, in Mauritius, in Ghana, in Rwanda, and all in Jordan, all over the world, because I can coach it better because I'm doing it here. Yeah. It's not theory.
Kind of cool. It's the same thing here as there, connecting, communicating, collaborating with one another as multiplying disciples and churches that transform communities. Like, I think things have to be heard and seen, just like Paul did with Timothy, what you've heard and seen. And so there's great training, but that relational component of that permeates our relationships. Just like I texted you the other day, Doug, I'm so honored to co-labor with you. And I feel that like I'm intuitive, and the same way with you, Roger, the same way with you, Zach. We just had Zach Medlock on an earlier one. That same intimacy with Jesus and with the Father, that is eternal life, and that's experiential. I think that's what Jesus wants to multiply. Like I know it is. I mean, that is John 17. And so that the pebble in the pond is Jesus. And doing that with everywhere, with everyone, is what we're working on with one another. And that's what this whole podcast is about, man. More disciples like that. Right. So I have a saying that I'm that I'm fond of saying that I'm not very good at. Calvin said an effective communicator was one that could practice lucid brevity. And that means it's short and you can understand it. I think I fail on both. I'm not even 50% effective, okay? But with lucid brevity, Zach, because you speak Lee, like that was a pretty good job. But like, could you explain even the larger fractal of where that is relationally crossing over all those boundaries and everything that we're getting to do with one another simultaneously, not sequentially?
Maybe Lee's looking for an example, Zach.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really grateful because this is happening way faster than I could have ever dreamed. But so, for example, I had talked about disciples and churches here in Indianapolis that have emerged as a DMM CPM, disciples and churches in a city. Well, that larger fractal that Lee's talking about, Indianapolis, we are now working with the same similar type of disciples and churches in Tampa, in Oklahoma City, in Houston, in Georgia, in New York, in Michigan, in Tennessee, in Missouri. Like we're serving one another. The cool part about that, I think that Lee's getting that represents, in what I just mentioned, probably 8 or 9 different streams, movements, ideologies, churches, all different, not just Big Life, not just 2414. And I don't think that diminishes Big Life 2414 or any other church or team, just like me being a Duke doesn't diminish Lee being a Wood and us choosing to work together as families because it's better if we do that. So that example is like we get together a team of teams and network of networks on a monthly basis to connect, communicate, collaborate. Where are the gaps? How can we do this together? How can we serve one another? What's going well? What's not going well? And so that we can keep the bigger kingdom vision central, which is we want to see everyone, every place know and follow Jesus.
Yeah. How did it go from where you're at? I love that what you just said, like you got to take care of your garden before you steward your garden before you can steward the field. But can you just maybe share the story of how it even went from that to, okay, now it's hopping to different cities, it's hopping to different countries even. Like what happened there to make that jump happen?
Yeah. I thought early on that it would be sequential, but it's really simultaneous. And what I mean by that is this. When I moved back to Indiana in 2015 from Dallas, Texas, when I was there for 5 years, when I came here, it was like I was starting over relationally, everything. And I had just gotten trained by Curtis and I was gung-ho to see something happen, but I was alone. I was by myself. And so I remember going in our Red Barn, for those viewers that watched the Red Barn episode, right? And I put like 15 white chairs in a circle. I just got on my face and I started praying. I'm like, Lord, this has to be your work. Would you send laborers? Would you fill these chairs with laborers? This has to be you. And starting from zero, just asking God, praying for laborers. And so that same year, as I was praying for laborers there, I was already traveling to Congo and to Kenya and beginning to do other trainings to India, to Jordan. So simultaneously, I was only one step ahead. I was by no means an expert far down the line, but I knew a little bit and I was passing on what I knew. Right. So simultaneously in these other countries, in these other cities, while in my hometown, doing the same thing both here and there. So from 2015 to about 2018, I would describe that if listeners are familiar with the 4 fields, going and sowing. Right. And so that really early onset was because there was no work. We need to go into the harvest field. We need a prayer walk. We need to find new areas where the kingdom is not. And we need to share the gospel. And from like 2018 to 2020, a lot of work had emerged here in Indianapolis. And so we started grouping. One of our struggles in that, though, is it was hard to get people out of field 3 and the grouping back into fields 1 and 2 and developing leaders to see that multiplied greater. And so it's not just been this, hockey stick trajectory. It's been more like a balloon that's being deflated and inflated simultaneously, but growing in increments, where there's been years and seasons of hardness and years of seasons of great growth. And I think both are necessary. As we pursue disciples in churches, there will be purging, there will be conflict, there will be hardness. Look at the scriptures. We see that everywhere. And so we've done that, both resolving conflict, both here and there in our own city and other settings. But ultimately, if we don't quit, we win. If we persevere, we will see the harvest. If we don't make it, it's easy to make this about ourselves as laborers. I'm offended. I'm hurt. This person left me. This person isn't doing what I'm asking them to. It's easy to do that. I've been there. I've done that. And so I'm 33 years old. It's a good year to die. It's a good year to die to yourself.
That's great, Zach. Would you say a word about how you get out among the lost? Because I see what you do among fellow trainers. For instance, I have a buddy here, and he messaged me recently saying, hey, I'm spending the day with Zach Duke. I've seen you on the More Disciples podcast with him. You spend time with other trainers. But for the folks who are listening, you also maybe share how you get out among lost people and keep active in that.
Absolutely. And that is so necessary. And I'll say too, I'm a very naturally shy person, and I am not evangelistically gifted. So it takes a lot of prayer and daily courage to obey in that regard. But I can't abdicate that because he has asked us to do that. So what that has often looked like, I'll just give a couple examples. With my accountability partners, Josh and Austin, they would come over Wednesday morning, and then I'll go prayer walking afterwards. And so a couple of weeks ago, just went prayer walking in my neighborhood. Everyone knows the housing market and interest rates are at crazy levels. So houses are going up everywhere. So there's construction workers everywhere, just waiting to be engaged. And so one of the things I have targeted right now in this season is just walking on job sites. And my dad's a home builder. It's an alley-oop, right? Hey, I'm Mike Duke's son. I love this home that's going up. Can I pray for you? And just start a conversation. And so I got to share with some plumbers that were at a house a couple of weeks ago, Jake and Steve, and just got to share the gospel with them, pray for them, got their numbers to follow up with them. A unique opportunity right now is there's 5,000 Afghani refugees in our county that have come over from the crisis. And we have 16 people there a day that are literally running their recreational programs and have full access to share the gospel with them every day. So later this afternoon, I'm going down to that military base, and I'm going to be sharing the gospel with as many as I can. And so it's just finding what fields there are, intentionally planning, intentionally going. Doesn't happen on accident. So getting in rhythms with my accountability partners. What does your going look like this week? Who are you specifically going to talk to? And just staying in those rhythms so you don't just fall into apathy or forgetfulness.
It's perfect. You're active on a local level, doing that while you're active on a regional level with these trainers and other friends. That's fascinating, Zach. Say something, if you would, about the way you've been involved with the Tampa work with Lee, if you would, because I know that's been strong.
Yeah, and it's been a joy. When I think of Tampa, I think of people's names. I think of Amanda. I think of Linda. I think of Lee. I think of Stacy. I think of Dominic. I think of Damien. I think of Jay. Right? People come to my mind, and because that's what it is. It is family working with family. And so as I've gone down there, does one body do stuff a little bit different than me? Absolutely. But when I join a family, I join their customs. I join their traditions. I join, hey, how do you celebrate Thanksgiving, right? It's the same thing asking, hey, how do you work in this community? And you join in what they're doing. And it's a joy to do that and say, how can I serve you? And so when I go down there, I just jump in, they put me to work, and I get to spend time with them, get to spend time at the field. I've gone prayer walking with them. I've helped them do videos just to capture stories down there. I've run events with them for the community where my wife is sang, and I've just engaged people in the community. It's just been an absolute joy to walk with them physically and in Tampa, but as well as Tampa and the elders have come to Indy and have encouraged the Indy network and have strengthened us as like duckling discipleship, right? They're nice. As a city, disciples and churches, they're one step ahead, maybe even two steps ahead of where we are. So why would I be so prideful to not want all the advice and direction I can get from someone who's a step in front of us? So they've been just tremendous, just both as people and as a network.
Doug, one thing that's interesting where I love the relationship piece, right? So we think about the reach, the way that God has used Zoom, a tool, right? But that actually, where we connected around Zoom, we did a Zoom, whatever it was in 2016 in Tampa, where we were with one another, where I didn't even remember that Chris Wynn was at that thing, didn't know who Chris Wynn was. And I was like, dude, you were at that? Because he was at the Red Barn at the Duke Farm. And I was like, bro, you were at that? We connected there. And that's that relational piece with one another. And I really want people to catch this, that it doesn't have to be concrete, linear, sequential, that there can be differences of administration, differences of operations, but the self-same spirit. And for all of that white space that divides us, like those boundaries that we can model John 17:23 over socioeconomic, over geographical, over organizational boundaries, what tend to divide us, to see the fulfillment, to see Jesus's prayer answered by dwelling together in perfect unity, that the world might know the Father has sent the Son. So anyway, that's not a comment, man. I'll just throw it over to Roger. I just get excited about this stuff.
Yeah, I actually do have a question. Just as you were talking about Indianapolis and Tampa, you mentioned city disciples and churches. And you said that earlier too, like we're a city church. And I know that is something that might be different for a lot of listeners or even people trying to pursue movement work already. I'm going to ask you to explain that, but I want to say one comment real quick of where I was. At one point I was where you're talking about. I was a new believer. I was just taught to make disciples. I was thinking, okay, I was in college. Who's in my dorm? Who's in my classes? Who's in my running club? I'm going to share with these people. I'm going to do Bible studies with them, discovery Bible studies. We're going to try to group together. I was also way all over the place, up and down, hot and cold. I didn't have what you mentioned of like being in a group of people to hold you accountable so you can be consistent. So my consistency was all over the place. But eventually God, as he convicted me, had me keep on going. But then later on moved to Houston, and it was a mindset of like, okay, we're trying to reach this whole city, connect with other networks, but then we had the mindset of like, we got to be a network of churches, like that citywide churches. Started to understand like we got to be a church of churches. And that was something very new to even think about. So how to pursue even doing that was difficult and new and still something I'm growing in. And so I was thinking about just the people who have been pursuing movements for a bit, and maybe that's even a new concept for them. Maybe could you just explain just what do you mean by citywide church? And if somebody is at a place where it's like they are making disciples, maybe they've gathered church in their home, like how they can pursue even that next step of getting to multiplying churches and them collaborating together as a citywide church.
Good question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even just to share a heart piece behind that for those that are listening, like I love my wife. And even though I would say that she's perfect, in reality, everyone would know, well, that can't be true, right? And so the same is true of Christ's bride. Like I love Christ's bride in all shapes, sizes, and models because it's his. But that doesn't mean we say there's absolutely nothing wrong with it and try to make the best that we can to reach the world. So we love her, we adore her, but we also, as like husbands, like to our own wives and being the own bride, we want to prepare ourselves to be ready for Christ, that she would be most prepared. Right. And so if people are not doing a model that I'm doing, we want to bless that. But we also want to see more models of what we are doing so that people can see it, taste it, touch it, feel it, so that it can grow more quickly. So what that has looked like here in Indiana is, it really is fractals. And I know I say that word a lot, but it's a repeating pattern at every level. And so if you have the church in your home, like now you can have, let's just say you have a grouping of 12 churches in homes, right? And so the same one another's are happening in that one church as they are in the 12 churches. You are praying for one another. You're serving one another. You're giving and being generous amongst one another. You're evangelizing with one another, right? You're doing all the one another's. So essentially, you're just doing the same things at the greater level and can cover more territory, more geography, and have greater impact. So technically what that could look like is once you have that many churches and you see faithful, obedient, persistent, persevering laborers, you can actually raise up elders just like you see in scriptures. You don't work from right to left of like form elders, then start a church. You go and you start disciples in churches. And as you see faithful people, you now see it's self-evident and laid hands upon who these elders are. And now at that level, these elders can begin doing more strategic thinking, planning, geographical and type of ideation to go to new areas. And once that model exists, that rhythm could simply look like there's not like a way to do it, but a good way to do it is you don't need to gather all the churches together all the time. And I think the more frequently you do it, the more people will always just want to be in the one big group. And then that stops the going and the sowing. I would recommend either 4 times a year or twice a year where you gather these networks together. And it doesn't have to be mandatory, but just like make it available where these churches and leaders and laborers can come together. Another good part rhythm to do that at a city church level is have a monthly core laborers meeting and let them self-identify who that is, like who is hearing, obeying, and spreading at any level, at any competency. Come to this weekly time or monthly time, where we can pray, we can strategize, we can hear what's going well, not going well. So you have a leadership development happening within a stream of churches. And so essentially you're just creating greater administration and operation process that has come from organic relationships of simple churches.
So I'm hearing you say, like, maybe even in scripture, you see Paul write a letter to the church in Thessalonica or gathers the elders of Ephesus, which are
exactly.
That's the citywide church that has multiple churches meeting in homes, most likely together, united. And some other practical things I heard you say from that was as you have churches multiplying, kind of be that church of churches, like do the same thing amongst the 12 that you said that you have with smaller. One thing that I learned too is like even go with the intention to start a network because, so much of our churches, especially coming from like non-denominational churches or maybe even churches that are more independent of one another, that you can think about your house church as just like, this is our church and not thinking about the regional way. So I learned just kind of like go into it with the intention of like, hey, if we start another church, we're still going to network together. We're going to love one another. We're going to be a church of churches, even at that small level, for anyone listening and might be saying, I don't have a dozen churches, A
good way to think about that is just family. I think it's so easy to be in business organization mode. But when you think about family, when I was a kid, I literally thought about, I'm going to be a grandpa one day. I'm going to be a dad one day, right? And a grandpa isn't, and if it's healthy, is not disconnected from his son or grandchild. And so there's not this disconnection that's greater along the way. It's actually no, family is family and we stick together. So thinking like father, grandfather, great grandfather is helpful to think how things stick together. Even as, as a grandfather, you don't want your son and grandson to live with you because they're codependent. You want them to go, but relationally, man, they're yours. We're together.
So something here, great, Roger, that it might be helpful around there, because I think this is a great topic, is we've had both Lucas Pulley from Underground and Tommy Colonan on, okay, and Zach now. So if we think about the city church as a church of churches, but they don't all have to be like completely organic, decentralized, DMM, CPM churches. So in other words, we still love our brothers and sisters. Tommy Colonan is the pastor of, he doesn't like traditional. He says, I'm an urban hip hop thing, man. I'm anything but traditional. So it's like we're actually collaborating with one another, completely organic, decentralized city church. That's what One Body is in Tampa. Underground might be a little bit different. Tommy's a little bit different, but we're collaborating together as different models as a picture of a city church. And I think that that is like insane that people don't do that with one another. I'm definitely not as clear about it. I think Zach gave a better explanation than I've ever done actually on there. That's what another thing that I love about it.
Lee, why don't you share real quick on the same vein of how, the church here in Indy and the church in Tampa work together financially to help our brothers and sisters in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so that's crazy. So like less than we've had Dominic on here too, but less than 0.1% of 1% of funds in a Western context goes to help our suffering brothers and sisters globally who are dying for the gospel. So we can actually share our resources and have done that with our suffering brothers and sisters in Southeast Asia intentionally, strategically, as disciples in churches with 100% of it going, like with no admin or operational fees. And to do that as DMM, CPM disciples in churches, so we can actually operate that way because we started with nothing and our admin and operations flows out of that. And it's just really hard to understand. I think one of our challenges in a Western context is that I'd say 80 to 85% of people aren't entrepreneurial, right? Like, so we're good at getting stuff started apostolic prophetically, but then our shepherd teacher brothers and sisters that we love look at us and go, you guys are crazy. What is it? Well, we're flying the airplane while we're building the airplane, but we need you. We need one another is the deal. And sometimes we just don't do the one another's great. And so we're trying to do that. I think you're the elder statesman on this, and you've probably been working on this stuff longer than anyone else on this podcast. So hearing your voice or questions inside of there, like I think we're probably newer to this stuff and are talking about stuff that you've been doing for years, Doug.
Wow. I don't know even how to receive that. All I know is that in all of this talk, there's a crucial piece that we all focused on. And Zach, I think you play it out well. And that is, as we build, as we grow, as we share, as we train, there's this temptation for pride. And Zach, would you say a word, just so we all remind one another, would you say a word about how you have managed to avoid that sense of pride? Because you do seem to always be deferring and looking to others. You don't seem like you're trying to suck it in and become a big shot yourself. What do you do daily in this DMM world to beat down that temptation for pride?
Well, I'd be lying if I say I never battled with pride and extensively and often. It is always there and always knocking at the door. Something that is burned in my mind, and it was actually in Tampa with Curtis when we were doing a Module 2 training, which is stewarding networks and relationships. He ended his entire time and he just starts crying. And then he says, don't let pride ruin what God is doing. And when I'm watching him cry, I know he's not just thinking theoretically, I know he's thinking of people and times and streams where that has happened. And if we're doing disciple making right, people won't know who we are. If we're doing disciple making right, we will go into deeper obscurity and go into a greater position of serving. And I think what we have to fight, and where I have fought pride the most, is wanting people to see that this quote unquote works. And so my pride has most surfaced amongst my legacy brothers and friends and wanting them to see it and get it. So I would put my best foot forward rather than just putting my weak foot forward and serving. Yeah. And pride also can surface in me and I know you guys can relate to this, when you know what somebody should do and they don't do it and they think they know better than you, it's very easy to flex and be prideful. And I'm just like, okay. And so you just have to let them go and try it and fail, almost just like a teenager that thinks they know more than you. Man, that is hard. That is hard for me. My pride and my, relationships with people really, really struggle in that. So I think the way that I try to best protect myself in that is like knowing first that this has absolutely nothing to do with me. These disciples and churches will continue on without me. I'm not the one who is over this. It is Jesus. Amen. And if I think that I'm doing anything, I'm partnering with Satan and trying to self-exalt himself. And so that's the fear of God, I think, is what keeps me from pride. Yeah. And like I would say ultimate pride, not battling with it, but like giving into it. And and a wife who keeps me humble. she is not a yes man at all, and she calls me out. She strengthens me. Lee knows her well and knows that that's true. So
that's great. Yeah, and actually, just maybe a little bit of a plug. I was recently blessed by listening to some of your wife's music, Megan Dukes.
Oh, awesome! Praise the Lord.
YouTube. Yeah. So great singer. But yeah, even with this, I love you talking about that.
Throw that up
character
in the chat thing about driving stuff to Megan, because that heart, and Zach far outpunted his coverage, by the way. Like far.
Far. I like punted on the moon, man.
But if you can, like shameless plug, put that stuff in the chat or wherever that we can share about Megan's music, because it will be a blessing, man. It's just
that's right.
It's man, Zach, it's powerful that you could actually talk about the worship initiative. But I think Roger's got another question, the way that God's using that in a lot of ways. But go ahead, Raj.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, you talking about the pride aspect, and I love that you bring that up, because we can talk about so much practical stuff. And you've given a lot of helpful practical things that I hope myself and others listening to this will take away and be able to use to God's glory. But I was actually thinking about this yesterday, just when God calls a leader, you could say like Acts 6, when they were trying to have those leaders appointed. They look for people that were filled with the Spirit and of good character. Or I was reading in Luke 8 when it talks about the seed falling on different soils. On the road it gets snatched away. The loose soil, it burns up quickly. The thorns choke it out. But that's the thing it says about that good soil. The first thing it says, they receive it with good and noble character, and they persevere to bear fruit. And just so many more examples you could say about that. So I love that you talk about that, because I'm just realizing how much, as people grow as disciples and grow as leaders, how, you can train all the tools and stuff, but really what it is getting deeper into growing in our relationship with God and being more Christ-like and bearing the fruit of the Spirit. So I think that's really awesome, and I think we're close out of time, but I would be remiss if we did not ask you, to even just give like a personal story of how you've seen people's lives transformed and through this multiplying disciple-making movement and church planting movement that you're pursuing. Because we've talked a lot about a lot of big macro things, which has been awesome, but that story of transformed life always speaks to me a lot. So I'd love to hear one if you have one to share.
I'll share a pretty recent one, not the most recent one, but a pretty recent one. In July, we have quarterly disciple-making trainings, and this brother showed up. And I didn't know who he was, didn't know how he heard about it. He said that he saw a post on Instagram for a sign-up form for the training. I said, we didn't post about it. And he's like, well, I signed up and someone called me. I'm like, we don't have anybody that calls anybody. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I was like, yeah, this guy called me and I signed up on this sheet. And I'm like, we don't have any of that. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm the one that put this together, and I promise you, we don't have any of that. And he's like, well, here I am. I'm like, man, I think God wants you here. And he was a brand new believer, and his name was Mark. He's a refugee from Congo, and from DR Congo, and is 22 or so years old, and just had radically encountered Jesus this year, gave his life to the Lord. So anyway, he came to the training, and the Lord just rocked him and immediately, gave him the railroad tracks to run on. And he started prayer walking and sharing the gospel every single day. And I was personally now going with him, modeling and assisting with him. And for whatever reason, he found this park. I think the Lord must have led him there, that was full of Satanists. Almost every person he talked to was like, I'm a Satanist. Like, there's like this hub of this clan of Satanists, and he was just getting rejected. Well, he finally found one whose name was also Zach, who was a Satanist, and he repented and gave his life to the Lord. That next day, he brought him here. He was standing just a foot away from where I'm sitting right now, and decided to obey and get baptized, and gets baptized here in this home in our bathtub. And me and Mark go with him 2 days later, sit down and train him how he can begin to hear, obey, and spread immediately. We go to his apartment and say, hey, we need to burn anything that is full of your satanic rituals. Wow. And he's like, yeah, I've got a couple of these things. And I'm like, okay, let's go throw them away then and burn them. He didn't have a couple. His house was full of it, like piles and piles of Satanist and witchcraft books, of Satanist paintings, of Satanist jewelry, and big flags and mantras and masks. Like, you could not believe how much Satanist stuff is there. And he literally said, wow, I was blinded to this. I didn't know how much that I had. And so me and Mark and Zach went and burned all that in a burn barrel. And this brother set free. And the one prayer request he had was that he would get a job. Well, we prayed for him. Next day, he gets a job. Just amazing. So now Mark is modeling and assisting with him as I'm modeling and assisting with Mark. And just is so special. I'm actually going to be with Mark this weekend as well. So those people, those names, those faces, that's what keeps the fire hot. Yes, there's the big regional, national, strategic stuff, but we can never, ever leave our 1 or 2 or 3 people that we're modeling and assisting with. Those are the ones that keep us close to Jesus and abiding, doing the simple work.
Do we have time for one more story? So I just want this one occurred to me, the way that God does stuff. So there's somehow, I don't have it exactly right, but at the 2414 discipleship thing, we got to do the podcast for because of you, Doug. There's a guy that comes to faith, okay, in New York or something. Okay, so tell the story. I don't want to tell the whole story. And then they like show up. This is crazy. This
blew my mind. So I've got some great friends in New York, and Austin and Jack. And Jack had just come to faith recently. He's still in college, just an absolute beast. Love this brother. And so I was telling Jack, I was like, hey, I probably have some contacts for you in New York. I have this friend that's a new believer. He used to live in New York and he went to a college near you. Like, you've got to connect. In fact, he's going to come over tonight. I want you to meet him. You guys will love each other. He comes over. But so he comes over, and this is Mark that I'm talking about. The same guy that's the refugee from Congo. Used to live in New York. Same guy. I want to introduce Mark to Jack. So Jack walks out the door when Mark's standing right by me, and Jack goes, Mark, what? And Mark goes, Jack, what? And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. You guys know each other? It's like, yeah, we went to a same discipleship event together back in New York. I'm like, this is just too wild. The same guy that got this mysterious post on Instagram to come to this training also knows this guy from New York that just happens to be in my home. I'm like, Jesus, you're just too wonderful. You're too awesome.
Sounds like some story from Acts 8 or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. The importance of connecting and communicating and collaborating. Yep. So that's great. All right. Well, that's all the time that we have. And it was such a blessing to have you, Zach Duke, yet again on the podcast. Absolutely. But now we could actually hear your full story. So I'm sure our listeners and viewers will see you again at some point, subbing in, maybe doing another podcast like this. I feel like we ran out of time. Like, we had so much more to talk about.
Yeah. We could do a part 2 with Zach, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We'll plan it. All right. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
God bless.
Love you guys. See ya. Bye-bye.
Appreciate you, Zach.
How are you making more disciples? What problems have you encountered? What successes have you celebrated? What questions do you have? Share your stories with us by visiting moredisciples.com/contact. If you're looking for next steps on growing your ability to make and multiply disciples, visit moredisciples.com to find resources, tools, and events all designed to help you make more disciples.